You know what you're doing? You're taking your inability of your human mind. By the way, this is true for all human minds, because we got to categorize. We always have to categorize, all right? It makes it easier to think about it, but in the end, it's just lazy, all right? So you say, boy or girl, are you a boy or a girl? And then someone is androgynous, and it makes you feel uncomfortable. But just because you feel uncomfortable, does that give you the right to come back to a person who's expressing their freedom of self?
Okay, stop whatever you're doing right now. Because what you're about to watch is one of the smartest men on the planet walk into a live debate and completely flip the script on one of the most controversial topics of our time. Piers Morgan thought he was going to corner Neil deGrasse Tyson. He had his argument ready, his statistics lined up, and his confidence fully loaded. And Neil just smiled. Because this is what happens when you bring an opinion to a science fight.
It doesn't, but I think what I would say, right, but what I would say to this, here's where it gets more complicated. Take the issue of transgender athletes in women's sport, for example.
Okay, I got 2 more sentences and I'll jump right into that.
Okay.
I just want to set the table here.
Yeah.
I'm setting the table where, okay, that if we allow gender to appear on a spectrum, gender expression to appear on a spectrum, as is apparently the case in the real world, where people have the freedom to do so, then for you to put your limited capacity to think on a spectrum in a law that inhibits the freedom of others, that's not a free country. Okay, so now take it to the next step. Where do you want to take that?
Well, what I want to take it to is I don't disagree with that. I think in a free country, you should be allowed to identify whatever the hell you want to identify as. It's fine. I've got no problem with that.
Okay, so now where are you taking it?
So where I'm taking it specifically to say the issue of transgender athletes in women's sport, which I think has, in an attempt to provide fairness and equality for trans athletes, in women's sport, it doesn't apply the other way in men's sport. In women's sport, it's created a new inequality and unfairness where you have trans women born with superior, powerful male biological bodies who are beginning to beat women with comfortable ease in many sports, and yet they were very unsuccessful comparatively when they competed against other biological males as they were before they transitioned. So my question, I guess, there is, isn't that a clear case where science has to be the determining factor? Because if you remove that from this equation, then you end up with gender-neutral Olympics and women don't ever win an Olympic medal again.
Well, there are certain events that the men, like the uneven bars, you won't find men on the uneven bars. It doesn't work with male physiology. On that one. Okay.
But my point being, there are reasons why we divide the sexes in sport, is my point. And the moment you start allowing gender identity to overcome biology, I see there's a problem.
Okay, so all that means is we are on a frontier that has not been previously breached, which is, what do you do in a sport where now there's an inherent advantage or disadvantage based on the rules that existed for that sport, whereas previously those advantages or disadvantages didn't exist. So this is not complicated. In high school, in college, and a little bit of graduate school, I wrestled. Okay, I was captain of my high school wrestling team and undefeated. I weighed in high school 190 pounds. Do I wrestle the 125 pounder? No, that would be unfair. Because I'm 65 pounds heavier, twice as strong, and maybe even faster. So they set up a rule. I only wrestle people my weight. Wrestling has 10 weight categories to make it an interesting contest. Okay, so let me just make this up now, just as a starter point. The transgenderism usually involves hormone readjustments, okay? Testosterone, estrogen. And so we can imagine a future of sports where you're not contesting men against women, you're contesting people in certain brackets of hormone levels. And why not?
Okay, this is brilliant, and I need you to slow down and actually absorb what Neil just did. He didn't argue with Piers. He didn't say Piers was wrong. He pulled from his own life, his wrestling career, his 190-pound frame, the 10 weight categories, to show that sports has been solving the unfair advantage problem for over a century. He's not dismissing the concern. He's saying, we've handled harder problems than this before, and we figured it out. That's the move of someone who's been in 1,000 debates and never lost his cool once.
Is
Because
that
it
any
doesn't
different
work.
from separating wrestlers into 10?
I hesitate to lecture you about science, Professor Neil deGrasse Tyson. I really do. But I'll tell you why not. Because what they've already tried to do this. They've already tried to reduce hormone levels. What it doesn't do, that process, is reduce body mass or strength, which comes from the male biology.
Right. If you went through puberty as a male,
yes,
and then transitioned afterwards, right, then you'll have a bigger, typically bigger, stronger
and that's
body,
where I just think it's unfair. Look, I don't have
reflexes.
a transphobic bone in my
Let's
body.
get there. I'm getting there.
I want fairness and equality for trans athletes, but there's a big but here, I think.
I'm working my way up to that. So one possibility, like I said, I'm just making this up on the fly, is you have hormone categories. If that does not solve the problem, or to the extent that it doesn't, then you put in other rules that separate who's competing with whom. Like I said, we do this all the time.
Right.
All right? And by the way, are you going to go to Michael Phelps and say, you are genetically taller, and we have a floppier, I don't know if all of this is true, but some of it is true, you have floppier ankles and webbed fingers, and so we're not going to compete you in this race because you'll have an advantage that other people don't. No, we don't do that, do we? In fact, when you really analyze it, practically every gold medal, record-setting Olympic athlete has some genetic thing going on in them that other people don't have.
They do, but my response my response to that would be, I think Serena Williams has been on record as saying that she would lose to the top 1,000 male tennis players.
Yeah,
so my point being,
you
could be number 999 best in the world as a male tennis player, and become immediately, if you decided to identify as a woman, the greatest women tennis player of all time. Is that fair? I don't think it is.
Okay, so now watch. So it turns out, and I've done this, but others have done it as well, but I did it for myself to know it. If you look at world records from world-class athletes, let's say track and field, the 100 meters, men are about 10% faster. 200 meters, 10%. It fluctuates, but on average, it's about 10. The marathon, the men do it about 10% faster, okay? And you look at reflexes, it's about 10% faster. Where you have the biggest differences in weightlifting. But for speed and reflexes, it's about 10% faster. So if you wanted to find out where the top women's athlete would land among men, you look at serving speeds, for example, because that's how fast you can bring the racket to the ball, and find the point where the women's serving speeds match up with the men's serving speeds, okay? And then that's where you would land in the world rankings. What I will tell you is, people pay to watch sports not for how good the athlete is, they watch sports for how good the contest is. Let's remind ourselves of this. If we only watched sports for the greatest of athletes, you would never watch college football. Never. Because the worst NFL, the National, in the London audience here, National Football League, the worst National Football League team there ever was, could wipe their ass with the best college team there ever was.
Right.
Because everyone in the professions, each one of them was the best in their college. Okay? So, but we love watching college football. Why? Because the contest is equal. And you don't know who's going to win in advance. If you knew who was going to win in advance, you would never watch the sport,
that would be,
even if it was the best.
This, right here, this is the moment the whole debate shifts. Neil drops the 10% performance gap across multiple sports, 100 meters, 200 meters, the marathon, reflexes, all roughly 10%. And then he hits Piers with something nobody in this debate ever talks about. People don't watch sports to see the best athlete. They watch to see the best contest. The college football analogy? Devastating. Because he's completely right. You already know the NFL would destroy any college team. But you still watch college football. Why? Because you don't know who's going to win. That's the whole point of sport. And Piers has absolutely nothing to say to that.
To bring this bit of the interview to I think, a closure, I would say I get that completely. But the most important thing as a sports fan is you want to get a sense it's a fair playing field. That, I think, is really the crux of it.
So what you do is, in the future, what you would do is, So if the hormone levels categories don't work, then there are other categories, reflex categories. Okay? Have people compete in reflex categories. I would love that. Okay? Then there are people with pretty slow reflexes. They'll have different strategies and how they would win, and group them together. By the way, in chess tournaments, your chess rating puts you in a category where you only compete with other people in that rating.
That's
you
true.
don't compete against people where you beat them in 10 moves.
That is true.
So we are still at the dawn of how we will or should organize the future of sports in recognition of the gender spectrum. And we just have to put some creativity behind it.
Yeah.
I don't see any problem with it. That's why I never wrestled a 120-pound person.
And now Neil does something that almost nobody does in these culture war debates. He actually proposes a solution: hormone brackets, reflex categories, chess rating systems applied to athletics. He's not saying ignore biology. He's saying we're at the beginning of figuring this out, not the end. And instead of panicking and drawing hard lines right now, maybe we apply the same creativity that gave us 10 wrestling weight classes. That's not a radical idea. That's just problem solving. And Piers, the guy who came in swinging, is now just nodding along. And that right there is what separates a great debater from a great thinker. Piers Morgan is sharp, he's experienced, and he came prepared. But Neil deGrasse Tyson didn't just win this argument, he reframed the entire conversation. He took a topic that makes people furious on both sides and turned it into a science and engineering problem with actual solutions. No shouting, no personal attacks, just logic, data, and one unforgettable wrestling story. The question now is the world ready to think about sport the way Neil is? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if Neil just made you see this differently, you already know what to do. Like, subscribe, and don't go anywhere because the next one is even bigger.